All right, today's portion is going to be 2 Kings chapter 5. I wish we could have, maybe one day we will look at the rest of chapter 4 from last week, where we didn't get to cover the problem of lifelessness or the problem of worldliness, but now we're going to discover the problem of stubbornness. Really, like Becky had said, stubbornness will get us into a heap of trouble. Over and over again, we see Naaman had choices to make, and where he almost didn't make the right choice. We're going to read the portion, at least up until the time of Naaman's cleansing, and then hopefully we'll get a little bit to Gehazi. We talked about Gehazi. He was introduced last week, and we see him again this week, kind of filling out the picture we painted of him. And then we see him one more time in 2 Kings chapter 8. But let's read about Naaman's leprosy. One question though. If I were to ask you, give me one name in Scripture that sounds like or that is similar to Naaman, and if I were to tell you it was a female's name. Naomi. Naomi and Naaman and Naomi mean the same thing. It means pleasantness or handsome or pleasing to the eyes, nice to look at. So this is Naaman, whether he was named that by his mother or it just became his nickname as he went around strutting like Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. We don't know, but it does mean pleasantness, sweetness, handsome. So as we go through this portion, think in terms of how often the word servant comes up, how often the servant shows up, and also descriptors that explain who Naaman is. If you had to do a biographical sketch on Naaman, what are some of the characters that you would point out? What are some of the traits, other than the meaning of his name, which I just gave you the clue on that. Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, who happened to be Ben-Hadad at the time, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. The Lord gave Syria victory over his people Israel, and it was by Naaman. How was that accomplished? Well, according to Jewish tradition, which does not equate to the Bible by any stretch of the imagination, otherwise Ruth and Orpah would be sisters and daughters of Eglon, and then Orpah would be the mom of Goliath, and Ruth would be the great-grandma. You know, they just have great ways of weaving everything into a story, the Jewish tradition does. But in this particular story of Naaman, they have him being the one soldier who drew back his bow peradventure and let fly an arrow. And it hit Ahab, King Ahab, who was disguised as a private in the army. It hit Ahab between his armor, and it gave him a fatal wound. And so that's how he acquired this position of being the trustee of the king, is because he was the one that drew the arrow. And that's what Jewish tradition says. The actual fact that someone had drawn a bow and slew Ahab eventually with that wound is true, and it's in the Bible. But as far as it being Naaman, that's something that the Jewish tradition has added for us, and to my great delight. I love that idea. Anyway, add that to the list of accolades that Naaman has, because you're going to find out he has a lot of accolades that are piling up. He's already been called great and honorable and a commander and trusted by his master. He's been called all that the Lord gave him the victory. The Lord chose him to be used as an instrument of chastisement. And so even before the Lord heals him, the Lord is working in his life. And then he also says, and he was a mighty man of valor. Same kind of phrase used to describe Boaz. And then a mighty man. Boaz was described as a mighty man of wealth. And now he's called a mighty man of valor. And that's what Proverbs 31 woman is. A woman of valor, a virtuous woman. It's the same Hebrew word. When Hayel is used for a man, it's called valor or might or valiant. If it's used for a group of people, you're talking about a host of an army with many people, a host, and when it's used about a woman, it's translated virtuous. The only two times virtuous woman is utilized is Proverbs 31 and a descriptor that Boaz used about Ruth. Everybody knows that you are a virtuous Chayel woman, a woman of valor. And so here, Naaman gets that accolade here, a Syrian. And then the big but, not to be confused with, that's getting edited. You can't take me in public anywhere. Don't you wish, man, when you're out in public, you had an undo button with some of your speech, some of your behaviors? Well, I do on this one. So anyway, here comes the big but. In Joseph's case, we saw you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That was a pivotal thought that Joseph had, that all of his, whether he was bitter or a man of action for God, a man of faith, hinged on that one 3-letter word, B-U-T. Here, though, Naaman has this rank and this wealth and he's an influencer. He has power. He has horses. He has all the means, the respect, slaves. But he was a leper. And so anyone who tries to approach God as if to say, but look at all these good things I've done, but there's this one small deed that I did, surely you can overlook it based on my good citizenship in all other areas. It could not be overlooked for Naaman. It was a big issue for him. And really, leprosy, just like sin in our life, starts off small. Maybe there was a time where it was just like, well, look at that dry skin patch. I better put some lotion on it. Look at that thing. It's growing. And his wife starts saying, honey, you got to do something. We got to go to the doctor. And then you get the diagnosis, it's leprosy. And he kept hiding it, and all the while it was spreading. No matter how he altered his lifestyle, no matter how he changed his ways, it just kept spreading. Started off small, but it's getting to the point that even the little maidservant we're going to discover knows about it. So Naaman, great life, great resume. He almost hesitated to put in a little asterisk there, but used steroids. I'm just kidding. But was a leper. And that causes the whole crisis here. And he was the right-hand man of Ben-Hadad. And the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. And she waited on Naaman's wife. So they did have these raids. At this point, nobody is a vassal of the other. The king of Israel doesn't have Syria under its grip. Syria doesn't have Israel under its grip. It's just border raids, where they're just going back and forth with border fights, dealing with the cities on the edge. And in one of these raids, they managed to capture, just imagine, there you are in your sweet little village. Apparently, this little girl comes from a godly home. Where did she get her faith as she was surrounded by a culture of heathenism and pagan gods? Apparently from her beginnings. There was this faithful household there in that village on a calm morning, and then in comes these marauding troopers of Syrians. And they grab hold of everybody that they can. Maybe they burn, torch things, destroy the fields, maybe even slaughtered people. And then they go back and they got this little girl in tow. There the mother and father come out of hiding, up from the cellar, you might say, and they look around and they cannot find their little girl. Is she dead? Maybe at this point they're praying she is dead. Has she been taken captive? Did she wander away? And yet it says, oddly enough, in the verse that we just read, by Naaman, the Lord gave Syria victory over Israel. So this is one of the things, this little girl was taken captive, apparently from a faithful home, the fact that she had faith. And when she went to Syria, how is it that this little lass that doesn't have the strength to have to 50-pound bags of flour or anything of that nature, manages to make her way into the commander's, the king's right-hand man's household. Not some strong, strapping young man, not some a woman that knows all the tricks of the trade as far as cooking and cleaning and all that. You have this little girl that manages to find her way in the vice president's, you might say, palace. So even when this family, I'm sure, praying fervently for her, their prayers followed her. Their prayers would be for her faith, that her treatment, how she would be treated. It's a harrowing, horrifying situation here. And to recognize this, even in the most horrifying of situations, God still uses it. That's where faith is needed. So there she was. She was taken captive, a young girl. And thankfully, she waited on Naaman's wife. Then this little girl said to her mistress, "If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy." This little girl makes testimony. There's two things that we discover about this one servant, and that is she was thoroughly convinced of the ability of the prophet of God to do something about it. She was convinced that Yahweh had the capability of healing leprosy. Not that it was ever done before. There was, maybe it made some of the sensational headlines of made up stuff, but as far as all the other records, there was no other leper that was healed. And yet she had the faith to say to her mistress, "Oh, if only my master could go see the prophet." How did she hear about it? It's not like they had AOL. It's not like they had forums or newspapers online. Maybe her family was just very interested in what Elisha and Elijah were doing. I'm sure they thought our country is going to pot. Our nation, our king, what is our king thinking? The White House is full of, however we would say it today. They were of that same thinking about their nation because their nation, Israel, wasn't a mess. And yet they paid close attention to what Elijah and the other prophets were saying. So this girl was raised in faithfulness. She was able to believe that God could do something for Naaman, and she had a care, an earnest care for the family she was working for. Is it something that Naaman's personality evoked from her? Like he's good to me, my mistress is good to me. Is it something that their behavior drew out of her, that man, of all the places for me to be held as a slave, I'm glad it's this place. They almost treat me like a daughter. And so she was convicted that Yahweh could do something about it, and she had a loving care for those who was her employer, those who were basically boss over her. They could do with her what they wanted, and apparently they weren't taking advantage of that. Thanks be to God. So she dared say it. She dared approach it. Anytime you see a servant approaching a master or a mistress, we can say this: they must have historical evidence, precedence for them to be able to approach their master and not fear for their job or fear for their life. And so she approaches her mistress with such earnestness. As a matter of fact, my Bible has an exclamation point there. Oh, wait. Hebrew doesn't have punctuation. But anyway, she said to her mistress, "If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy." And then the wife went and told Naaman. And just imagine how difficult Naaman had right here. The wife goes and tells Naaman, here's what they're sitting at table. Maybe dinner time is served. They sit down, maybe he's on one end and she's on the other. After all, they are quite wealthy. And she says, excuse me, my lord. Our little servant girl told me of a man in Samaria who might be able to heal you. What? Listen, I've gone to all the physicians in Damascus. What makes you think there's anything in Samaria? I've gone to the temple here, and our God's better than their God because look at how we defeat them. That's how it was viewed. If we were victor, our God was better than the nation's God who we defeated. And so we recognize about Naaman as we read the rest of the story, he is a very hard man to convince if it makes him look bad. Is he going to listen to this foreigner, this woman, this child? I don't know if it was the wifely pleading that provoked him, that helped him along in making a good decision, or what it was, but he made a decision, I'm going to take this to the king, as if it's fact. Desperation will do that to us. Desperation will bring us to the point where we will shirk off all our pretense. We will acknowledge our brokenness and just say, all I can tell you is I need help. If we start propping ourselves up with different things, with a smile or with good works or with alcohol, it will catch up to us. But when we're broken. And Naaman went in and told his master. Who was his master? The king of Syria. Ben-Hadad, the king who had enough influence to garner and gather to himself 32 other kings and go to war. Who has that much influence? How many allies could we gather together as America? Could we get 32? How many allies could other countries gather together? Who has 32 friends? Our European Union? Somehow or other, the king of Syria was able to play everybody just so and to bargain and treaty just so that he could get 32 kings to join together with him in a battle. You can read about that in 1 Kings 20, I think. Anyway, and so Naaman goes to that king and he says, and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel. So he did tell the source. And the king of Syria said, that's ridiculous. No. The king of Syria says, I have heard about this guy. I have heard about how Israel and Judah went down to Moab and they overtook the Moabite army. I've heard some of these things. Tell me more. And so I'm sure Naaman confided in him. I'm sure the king of Syria knew about Elisha. And so the king of Syria said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel, Jehoram. And this is what happens. The little girl says, there is a man of God who can heal you in Israel. And the next thing Naaman does is he gets politics involved. Or this is not anti-politics, but he gets those who have power involved. He gets the influencers. He gets the people who's got, I can get, and starts using his network. Nothing against network. I thank God for networks. But you can just see the error of Naaman's way in this particular instance. There is a man of God in Israel who can heal you. Let me talk to the king about that. And the king of Syria says, I'll use my influence. And they go about it on these back channels way that is not God's channels. And this is getting Naaman's expectations all set up. It's positioning his mind that this is how it's going to look. This is what's going to transpire. I'm going to go to the king of Syria. He's going to get me into the king of Israel, and they're going to meet me, and they're going to do great grand things. Maybe it'll even lead to a treaty, and we can have 33 armies working with me in the next go around. And so, that they start changing what their expectations are and how they're going to see God work. Meanwhile, they're getting further and further away, it seems, away from the way God's going to do it. Thankfully, when we take a misstep, when we go the wrong direction, God has a way of steering us back to the right path. Yes, we are going to take missteps. Yes, we might. Sometimes we are frightened by taking a misstep that we're immobilized. We don't do anything. Go ahead. If it's the wrong step, go see the king of Syria. If it's the wrong step, God will have a way of turning it around. That's the glorious thing about his sovereignty in this, is that he still managed to get him to Elisha despite Naaman's plans and strategy. He goes to the king of Syria. The king of Syria, Ben-Hadad, writes a letter to King Joram of Israel. And he says, you can see why Joram freaks out here. King of Syria says, "Go now, and I will send you a letter to the king of Israel. And everyone knows the world revolves around me. If I say go, they go. If I say come, they come." So even the king of Syria has a problem here. So Naaman departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. Then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, and Naaman's thinking, this is it. This will prove whether or not the little girl is true. And he is met. Once the king read this letter from the king of Syria, "Now be advised, when the letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of the leprosy." That you may heal him of the leprosy. I'll get right on that. It's never been done before. No priest has ever seen a leper who was and then who was not. And so it can happen. King Joram had seen a lot of Yahweh at work. We saw it in chapter 4. There where he saved the armies. He had made the decision, the Lord is against us, and he's led us into the hand of the Moabites. And then Jehoshaphat said, "Does anyone here speak for God?" And they're like, "There's this thorn in my flesh. His name is Elisha. He speaks for God." And so Joram knows about Elisha. He knows him full well. He's experienced him. He's walked with him. And so when he reads this letter, his immediate thoughts was, who's the closest guy I know to God? Oh, no, it's not. I mean, he talks religion. He brings God into it, but he doesn't turn to God. Sometimes you know enough people who speak about God, but they never turn to God with their issues. And that's exactly what he does. And it happened when the king of Israel, Joram, read the letter, that he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore, please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me." You can just imagine him reading the letter like this. And then he's like, looking at his advisor, tears his clothes. And he's like, what? Only God could do this, make alive and to kill. Why is he doing this to me? And he looks to his advisors and he's like, don't you see what this is? He's trying to make war. And interestingly enough, it wasn't any of his advisors that suggested to him, hey, maybe we ought to ask that guy who made the desert full of pools for the horses and beasts. Let's go talk to him. Nobody said that. Instead, Elisha had to do it. So you can see, he at least admits this, that only God can do this. Only God can do this. And he's like, I am so glad you made that confession. And meanwhile, Naaman's hearing all this, and you can just see his head droop. What? Are you saying you can't do this? It isn't going to work? All you can do is tear your clothes? That's what I've been doing for the last however many years. And he's discouraged, disheartened, turn around, walk away. However, maybe he would wage war right then and there. And so it was, when Elisha the man of God heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes. It wasn't like they were FaceTiming this encounter. As Naaman was coming from Syria, from Damascus to Samaria, the people gave word. The watchmen gave word. Matter of fact, Samaria means watchtower or watch mountain. They saw Naaman coming and the word got out. And as the word got out, everybody found out about it, and Elisha found out about it. And and we saw from last chapter, Elisha isn't the keenest of observers, naturally speaking, but he's much more keen spiritually. But here he finds out about it and he sends word. So it was when Elijah the man of God heard about the hubbub and the gossip that was going through the mill there in Samaria, that the king had torn his clothes, that he sent the king. He sent to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So the drooped head of Naaman is raised. Like, what? What is this? Hey, He sounds more like that little girl. He sounds more like my servant. I want to meet that guy. I can't wait to meet that guy. This must be who the little girl was talking about. And he took leave from the king of Israel. Like, I don't have any time for you. It's interesting. The high and mighty get left behind. And I'm sure the king was kind of excited about that. Or he was nervous, like, oh, what happens if Elisha and Naaman hook up together? That's not good. So the Naaman went with his horses, plural, and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. He had gotten down off his horse, and he had plenty of them. And then Elisha did to Naaman exactly what he did to the king of Israel. He sent a messenger. So Elisha sent a messenger to Naaman and said, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and ye shall be clean." But Naaman became furious. He became furious as he thought to himself. You know how it is sometimes when you think into yourself, like, you know what he said? And then he said that to me. And then, in my mind, this is how the dialogue is going to go down. I'm going to say, yo, and I'm going to say, yo, mama. And then they're going to be like, what? I changed my way. And then I'm going to say, you have this dialogue in your head. That's how it's going to go down. And then you almost treat the other person the next time you see them as if you had that conversation. Like, where is this animosity coming from? How did we end up here? What? And so there it was. Naaman thought to himself. He thought himself into anger, into being furious and outraged. It's just dangerous to take counsel with just ourselves. It's just me and God. That's all I need. That sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, don't be so dangerous. That's a dangerous thing in a way. God put us in community for a reason. He put us in a body for a reason. And so Naaman thought to himself, and he was furious. You'll notice he didn't ask any of his servants, and why should he? He is the commander. He became furious and went away and said, indeed, I said to myself, this is how my expectations were raised. As I went to the king of Syria, and he granted me an audience and wrote a letter for me, and then I went to the king of Israel, and I made these demands of him. I was in high company. And I said to myself, this is what it's going to look like. I'm going to ride up on my white stallion, and out shall come Prince... no, that's Cinderella's dream. But he had these ideas of what it was going to look like. And this is what he said. Indeed, I had said to myself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. This is how it's going to work when God... This is it. Our expectations. He has an expectation of how God will come to him. God's going to come to me through a sermon, or God's going to come to me through a song, or God's going to come to me by the success of a certain ministry. And then I'll know God's there. He had ideas of how God was going to come to him. He's going to come out, and he's going to come out and be awestruck by my gallantry and my horses and my chariots. And then he had an expectation of what the ministry was going to look like. How many people have started a ministry and you really had no idea what it was going to end up looking like? And God was in that ministry. At the beginning, you're just like, this is not working. This is a failure. This is not how I imagined it. And that's the way it is. Sometimes we say, this is how God is going to come out and speak. This is what the ministry is going to look like. And this is the means that God is going to use. He's going to use Lutheran housing services. Or he's going to use this venue. Instead, God uses means that are totally different. He doesn't wave his hands in front of the leprosy and it all goes. He doesn't do a Benny head slap on the head. He doesn't do all that. And that's exactly what Naaman wanted. And so just sometimes our expectations can set us up for failure. How God speaks, the means of what the ministry is supposed to look like, and the means that God will use to, is it going to be Lutheran housing services, or is it going to be some guy named Sam? Is it going to be some servant coming out of Elisha's house? I thought the king of Israel was going to do something big. Or it's just a servant of a servant who came out and said, oh, message, sir, go to the Jordan and dip 7 times. And Naaman confesses, this is how I thought it was going to go down. And it wasn't. I mean, the only reason we know this is because he's sharing it. Indeed, I had said to myself, this is what it's going to look like. Are not the Abna and the Pharpar rivers of Damascus better than all the waters in Israel? Could I have not washed and Naaman be clean? So he went away in a fury and turned away. His wife was not there to help him process. So this is one of the reasons why we see him in a fury. And he's going on and on. The Abna River is a river in Damascus that flows to Damascus from Mount Hermon. It means stony. Quite the opposite of the Mississippi River. Quite the opposite of the lakes and rivers in Texas where it's all mud. All mud bottom. But here it's a stony river. And the Pharpar means rapid. It's descending at such a rate that you get the glorious rapid and the power of it. And it's all there in Damascus, and it all flows into Lake Damascus, the lake of the meadow. And he's thinking about the clear, stony bottomed lake river and the rapids, and he's like, Jordan? All that does is bring down debris and mud and murk and muck. It's descending at such a rate, not with rapids, but it's just carrying torrentially all this muck down until it goes into the Dead Sea. And you know what happens there? Once the Jordan reaches its end, it's called the Dead Sea for a reason. There's no life in it. And so Naaman is thinking about the physicians there. He's thinking about the rivers there. And he is a little put out with the whole situation. Expectations got in the way. Pride got in the way almost of seeing a work of God. And the desire for dramatics. The desire for dramatics can get in the way. How many mothers desire dramatics and instead they got diapers to change, dishes to wash, and clothes to fold? Just give me, like if I could just, I don't know, bungee jump over the Grand Canyon. I'm not for sure what adventures mothers think about, but you can say this, it's not very dramatic. And so there's that craving for drama that can sometimes have us miss the mark altogether, miss a work of God. And then he goes on that rampage, he says these things, and another servant of his came near, dared to approach him while he's in this rage. So apparently, either the servant really, 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 really loved him that he dare risk his life, or he just like, oh, I know how it works with Naaman. He always says no at the beginning, and then you can process through with him. He will listen to reason. He's a man of reason. And so I'm going to go and give him some feedback. And his servant came near and spoke to him and said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you have not done it? And he positions Naaman's mind and he says, you're capable of great things. We all know that. You don't have anything to prove to us. If he had asked you to do something great, we all know you'd do it. After all, you killed King Ahab. You're the commander. There's a reason. And he's like boosting his confidence back up. Like, it's okay, Naaman. You have nothing, no need for pretense here. We won't tell anybody. Almost, it's as if he's to say. But it just shows me the fact that he has the affection of these servants and the interest. I think, yes, he must have been a pleasant man. He must have been a Naaman. And so he said, wouldn't you have done it if they told you to do great things? Yeah, you would have, and you would have done it with ease. How much more then when he says, wash and be clean? You're going to walk away. You're going to go back and tell your wife, well, he told me to wash in the Jordan River. And your wife's going to look at you like, and you did it. No, I'm too big for that. That's beneath me. And his wife's like, leprosy, intimacy, all gone. Because you don't want to wash in the Jordan River 7 times. Was it too hard? Could you not swim? What? And so they're remembering that he'd have to explain this to his wife. Oh, wait. That's not why he did it. And they're remembering, just thinking, yeah, you know what? What is it going to cost me? It could have cost him this. Did everybody know that he was a leper? Had he made confession? Did people know what his sin was? Not that leprosy is a sin, by the way, but metaphorically speaking. He was about to get vulnerable as he stripped himself of his garbs, disrobed, and the servants and soldiers and the entourage that was with him in his wealth stood back in a gasp, like, what did he just confess to us? What weakness, what fault? James says, confess your faults one to another, that you may be healed. Just getting vulnerable, that's what AA is all about. You confess your faults one to another. I'm Deborah, and I'm an alcoholic. I have a struggle. It's like, all right, we can help you with that. We'll be your phone call buddies. We'll be your sponsor. We're going to see you through this. And Naaman had to come clean. That was a poor pun. But Naaman disrobed, and he showed that he had leprosy. Maybe that was his hesitancy. Maybe it was just pride. It could be pride. It could be the fact that he was being asked to be vulnerable. That stops a lot of us. We're not proud, but I ain't telling you that. I don't know if I can trust you. This desire for dramatics. So the servant tries to speak reason to him, and he takes it. And he addresses him, my father. So Naaman went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. The God of restoration. He almost missed the opportunity to know the God of restoration because of his pride, because of his desire for dramatics, and because of his expectations. He almost missed out on what it is to be, like, let's say he's a 40-year-old man, to have his skin restored like the skin of a baby, of a child, not the rough, gruff, calloused hands of a soldier, but the softness of a baby's skin. He almost missed out on that because of thinking more highly of himself than he ought, because of stubbornness. I was going to name this the problem of nationalism because he kept talking about, well, Farpar and Abna and all that is better, and if we can't do it, no one can. But we didn't go with that because it's not a universal situation. It is stubbornness of himself. And he brought into his stubborn thinking all the various reasons why he ought not to do it. And he almost missed out. And the God of restoration, he always restores above and beyond what we lost. We lost the Garden of Eden. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Eve. But we will get the presence of God and Jesus Christ in heaven, which is far better. Peter lost the opportunity to speak on behalf of the 12 disciples there when he denied Christ in the courtyard, there at the fire of coals. But he regained the opportunity to speak the first message of grace there on that day of Pentecost. And 3,000 souls were converted onto him, onto Christ. But the God of restoration, how many times do we not know it? Paul loses his sight and he gains insight into what the new covenant looks like and the reason why Christ died. And so, yes, if we've lost something, do not count it all loss. The God of restoration still can do the things that the story of the other Naaman, Naomi, totally restored. So he was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And he returned to the man of God. He and all his aides came and stood before him, and he said, indeed, now I know that there is no God in all the earth except the God of Israel. Therefore, please take a gift from your servant. And it's as if Elisha says, the reason I didn't come out to you to begin with is I want you to know this is between you and Yahweh. Has nothing to do with me, the magician. Nothing to do with me, your advisor or counselor. This is just you and God. And the reason I had you do the Jordan River is because it has nothing to do with how good you are, how well you present your best behavior. Naaman still had to do something. Just like the ditches had to be dug, the jars had to be collected, Naaman had to do the dipping. This is not an advertisement for Copenhagen. But Naaman had to do the dipping, and out from this dirty river comes new life. That ought to give us great hope. Especially when you think, are my behaviors, are my choices, are my decisions as good as Pharpar? Are our children's that good? You think, man, I don't know. But out of the Jordan River, even God can end up cleansing somebody. And that gives me great courage. Because I know I can't be like that Stony Bottom River. I got a lot of muck to stir up. Each time it gets little precipitation, there's muck that gets stirred up. And so Elisha wanted him to know, this is between you and God. It is not between the king of Syria or the king of Israel. It's not between the little girl and the man of God. It's between you and Yahweh. And he can use whatever means he wants. Will you participate with him? Will you humble yourself? Will you be satisfied with the small things and do Jordan instead of Damascus? And Naaman had to. That's what Jesus said. Narrow is the way. Straight is the way and narrow the gate. You're going to have to get off that high horse. It's not going to be your entourage that makes it through. And Naaman did, and we see him being blessed. And he even says, I see now. It's not you. It's not the kings. It's not my wealth. It's not all the shekels of silver that I brought. But it's just Yahweh. And so he says, I understand now that Yahweh is God. And, but he said, as he tried to offer a gift to Elijah, another thing I want you to know, Naaman, it is not about paying God off. That is not the kind of God we serve. You can't pay for it. You can't behave well enough. Like, well, now that he did this for me, I guess I better behave well enough to prove to him that I love him. That's not it. And so Elisha refused to take it from him. As the Lord lives before whom I stand, I will receive nothing. And he urged him. Naaman urged Elisha to take it, but Elisha stood steadfast. So Naaman said, then if not, please let your servant be given 2 mule loads of earth, of soil, of Israel's soil from the land. For your servant will no longer offer either burnt offerings or sacrifices to other gods, but only to Yahweh. Yet in this thing may the Lord pardon your servant. He's already thinking in terms, how might I please God? How might I please the Lord? And he says, when my master goes to the temple of Rimmon, the god of wind and storm, to worship there, and he leans on my hand, sometimes I have to bow down in the temple of Rimmon. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord please pardon your servant in these things. I'm just doing my job. I'm there helping my king. I'm not going to go there and create a revolution. I'm still going there with my king. I'm still the commander-in-chief of Syria. The Lord please pardon me. And Elisha says to him, go in peace. You know, just what that means, to me it means you and God get to decide this, Naaman. You be where you're at. You can have the soil. As far as what's happening in that temple to a foreign god, you decide that. You're the one that has the job. Go in peace. I see your trust in the Lord. Or it could be he's like, that's fine. It could be that he's saying that. But Elisha didn't say that straight up. And he didn't say, don't do it. He didn't say, do it. And sometimes when we're counseling and visiting with people, we need to be cautious not to do that as well. Let God minister to them to Scripture through the Spirit. And then he departed a short distance. And we'll quickly read here about Gehazi's greed. So there Naaman is. I mean, he's a changed man. Didn't go according to expectation. The king of Syria really was no help. The king of Israel showed his true colors. He didn't learn anything there when his armies were spared and that he had the victory over Moab. It's like, I don't know what happened in the Jordan River, but I know this. There is one God, and it's the God of Israel. And he's on his way, merry way, going home. He's like, can you believe this? Can I believe this? And so some advisors are saying, I didn't even know you had leprosy. Well, my wife does a good makeup job. You know, they're all chatting gleefully as they're on their way home. And he's like, I can't believe they didn't take anything from you. And then maybe Naaman's concluding, maybe that's the way Yahweh is. You can't buy him. You don't have to appease him. But then Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, this is what he's saying to himself, Naaman, my master has spared Naaman, the captain of the Syrian army. I know a little girl who was taken by the Syrian army, and it only seems right that we should take something from them. You can just imagine all kinds of rationalization that's going on in Gehazi's mind. By the way, I don't know if he knew the family, but they knew of somebody who had been afflicted by the Syrian army. And Gehazi said to himself, I can't believe my master let him get away with that. Like he's now going to be all the more able and capable to do his position and be a leader. Look, my master has spared Naaman, the Syrian, while not receiving from his hand what he brought. But as the Lord lives, I'm going to run after him and take something from him, just like he took something from Israel. By golly, I remember those raids. And he's got all kinds of excuses, reasons, and why-hows. So Gehazi pursued Naaman. And when Naaman saw him running after him, he got down from the chariot to meet him and said, he's still like, hey, is all well? Everything going okay? He's still happy. And he said, all is well. My master has sent me, saying, indeed, just now 2 young men of the sons of the prophets have come to me from the mountains of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of garments. So Naaman said, yes, by all means. Here, please, take 2 talents. And he urged them and bound 2 talents of silver in 2 bags and with 2 changes of garments. And he handed them to 2 of his servants. And Gehazi and these 2 servants carried them on ahead of him. And when he came to the hill, he took from the 2 servants the 2 talents and the 2 garments from their hand, and he stored them away in the house, which probably is his house. He stored them away in his house. Then he told the servant people, oh, you can go now. I'll take it from here. And they departed. Now Gehazi went and stood before his master, and Elisha said to him, this is the Elijah who usually doesn't see things that are straight in front of him naturally, materially. But here he could see. Elijah said to him, where did you go, Gehazi? And he said, your servant didn't go anywhere. Sounds like your kids, don't it? I didn't do nothing. I wasn't anywhere near there. And then Elisha said to him, did not my heart go with you when the man turned back from his chariot to meet you? Is it time to receive money and to receive clothing, olive groves, vineyards, sheep and oxen, male and female servants? Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and your descendants forever. And he went out from his presence, leprous, as white as snow. We learned last week that Gehazi could definitely case a joint. And you could see what's what and who's who. And this is one of those instances where it cost him. He's like, this doesn't make any sense. It's not fair. I remember seeing that guy in the last raid on the border town of Ramoth Gilead, and I did not like it. And yet, he came up with his own solution, and he did it his way, and he was found out. And he's probably thinking, Mom will never know. She's like in there watching Days of Our Lives, it seems like. Meanwhile, she's darning socks, So he had that same thing about Elisha, and Elisha did know. And it's interesting that he says, and he was white as snow, because the white leprosy is the one that's impossible to cure. So the leprosy of Naaman be upon you, Gehazi. The white leprosy, the one that Naaman would not have gotten any relief from. There would have been no remittance. So Gehazi, we will see him again in chapter 8. Matter of fact, he'll even be serving before a king. So there's something about what Gehazi was able to do that made him still presentable in public. So don't let pride, stubbornness, the thirst and hunger for drama, or not just drama, but adventure. If I could just be more adventure, if I could do this, be the pastor or do public speaking, or if I could be the one that got to do this or that, drive the bus, lead the singing. Don't thirst after adventure that you might end up missing God's blessing, God's restorative power, God's mighty work. Pride, the thirst for adventure, and expectations. Don't box God in with our expectations. Recognize that He may do something else. Do it a different way. Do it a more shameful way than what you're like. This would be a shame for me to dip in the Jordan River, and yet Naaman did it. There's a lot more. Priscilla Shire has a video on this that we watched one time. Khaki still has that, I'm sure. Lessons learned from the story. There's a lot. I mean, basically, to me, when the Bible says, when Christ says, blessed are the poor in spirit, Naaman showed us what it is to be poor in spirit. He even got to the point where a servant could approach him and said, go dip yourself 7 times in the Jordan River. 6 times he was that haughty guy, like, I can't believe I did this. This is humiliating. The 7th time he dipped down, he's like, this is what humility got me. I am so thankful that I dipped the 7th time. You know, I'm sure it was infuriating the first 6 times. But the 7th time it had changed his attitude altogether. Questions? From here or abroad.
What was the significance of having to take dirt?
What was the significance of having to take dirt? You know, I'm not for sure if that was just something in Naaman's thinking. Like, I just want...
My self-study Bible said...
I read a commentary on that. And he was taking holy ground.
He was taking holy ground.
Back. From Israel back so that he could worship on holy ground.
I like that. What did you have, Carol Puckett?
Said that to worship, you needed the soil of the land of the God to worship on. So he was that same thing. He was taking that soil back so he could worship God on that.
Yeah, land. So he was taking soil from the land that God was in charge of. A lot of the gods at that time were territorial, viewed territorially. Obviously, Yahweh was beyond that. Matter of fact, they approached sometimes the Syrian army. Ben-Hadad went into war and he says, oh, Israel only has a God of the hills, he called them. Yahweh is just a God of the hills. And they found out otherwise, but the idea that they're territorial, and so he's like, I want some of this holy ground. The land is a big deal throughout the Old Testament, and I wonder if he just wanted a part of the land, the temple, the priesthood. Those are the 3 big things in the Old Testament. But what was Naaman thinking? Just wanted holy ground. I like that idea.
Why did the servant address him as my father? I mean, you don't think of servants being that informal.
Why did Naaman's servant, address Naaman as my father? Maybe he was cowering as he's approaching him, like, I could call you master, but I'm really pleading for the mercy of a father. Or it could be that Naaman was just the kind of reputation where if you've got some feedback, he's willing to gather the data points. Have you ever met a person that is not interested in data points, did not receive feedback, they just think through themselves and they think they've arrived at the best answer? Oh, I just happen to know somebody like that. But so maybe they realize this guy really is a gatherer. He is wise. He will seek counsel from even those below him. And maybe that's why he was so successful. And so it could be the relationship that he had with his servants is that I'll take care of you if you take care of me. I'll have your back if you have my back. Not that that's how fathers are, but to be able to say, I know he'll take care of me. He'll receive this feedback. So it could be that he's cowering, he can't believe he's coming to it, and he's trying to plead the mercy of a father as opposed to a master because he knows that could get him into trouble. Or it could be that this was one of the pleasant things about that pleasant man, Naaman, and how he dealt with his servants. Because really, his servants show up strong here. They're captives, they're prisoners, they're there against their will, and yet they're wanting his success. Even Elisha participates in his success. In the next chapter that we read next week, we'll read those Syrian soldiers are back. Blessed are the poor in spirit. This is the poor in spirit one. When he swallowed his pride, he was cured of his leprosy. And that's a good medicine. Swallow your pride.
So that's why you said he was cured twice?
Yes. Did I say he was cured twice? But yes, he was cured twice. He was cured of his leprosy, and he was cured of his pride.
Luke 24:27.
Oh, yes. Thank you for that reminder. Yes. So there you have it. In Luke chapter 4, verse 27, Jesus brings this up. Jesus is in the synagogue there in Nazareth, his hometown, and he makes a statement. I have come. He quotes from Isaiah. He says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. I'll put a period there for now. Whereas in the Old Testament, it goes on to talk about the day of the Lord, of the wrath. The acceptable year of the Lord, and he says, this is my ministry, and I'm here to fulfill that. And they were all the eyes were on him, and they were fixed on him. And he began to say, it is fulfilled in your hearing even today. I'm here. And they all bore witness to him, and they marveled at his gracious words. They were marveling like, wow, I can't wait. I can't wait for him to do all that for us, for the Jews. We're going to rise up against the Romans. This is going to be great. There's going to be restoration. And then he brings up 2 Old Testament miracles. And they both are Gentiles. As if to say his ministry is going to include not just the nation of Israel, it's going to include Jew and Gentile, friend and foe. And so he brings up the prophet is not accepted and is no prophets accepted in his own town. But I say, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elijah when the heavens were shut up 3.5 years. And there was great famine, but to none of them did Elijah go, except to the widow of Syrophoenicia, which is not Israel, Lebanon. And in the region of Sidon to a woman who was a widow. And many lepers were in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. And for some reason, that little servant girl had the vision for this. Like, where did she ever get that idea? It says right here, no leper was ever cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. And all those in the synagogue who were marveling at the gracious words of the Lord just a moment before, when they heard these stories of healings for the Gentiles and the enemy, they were filled with wrath and wanted to push Jesus off the brow of the hill. And sometimes you got people full of wrath in your own life against you. They want to say, bring it on, let's talk about this. I understand what you're saying. And they're trying to engage in arguments, baiting you, trying to get you to engage. And Jesus, you need to do what Jesus did here. And you just need to walk through their midst and leave them. Set up boundaries and go on your way. That's what Jesus did. He did not engage in argument with them after he said, it is going to the Gentiles as well as to the Jews. They got upset that Jesus was opening the door to their little clique club. And that's Nazareth. So it is interesting that Jesus brings up these miracles that are dealing with the enemies of Israel rather than using other examples of healings. Raising the Shunammite woman. Why didn't they talk about the Shunammite boy? Why did Jesus have to talk about, why did you do that, Jesus? You're such an instigator. Sometimes he was an instigator, and this was one of those times. But he walked away from it. And sometimes it's good to be an Elisha. If you see it in your friend's life, that, hey, let's talk about this issue of stealing from God. Or sometimes it's good to be I would say when you are a Gehazi to come afterwards and say, I've made a big boo-boo. I put at my house 2 garments, 2 talents of silver, and I need to make right. And see what God ends up telling you to do. Take it back to Naaman, actually donate it, however that all works. But there was restoration for Gehazi available. He too could have experienced what restoration felt like, just like Naaman experienced it. When Elisha gave him the opportunity and said, where were you? Just like God there in the garden, the first question asked, where were you? is to say Gehazi had to decide at that moment. And he opted to side on the side of lying. Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5 encountered the same thing. Yes. We are going to cover 2 Kings 6 next week. Very interesting. Some things you're like, oh, why did that get recorded in Scripture? But God pays attention to even the small things in life.
One of the commentaries I read just led us back to the 10 lepers that Jesus healed. It was only the foreigner that went back and thanked him. And here we have the foreigner
that was healed, yeah.
Back and thanking. So that was just a good thing to remember. I think that is convicting. We're followers of Jesus, and He gives us all these blessings. Sometimes I don't think we stop and remember to give thanks.
Amen.
We just kind of almost expect them.
Eucharisteo.
In red.
I just find it extremely interesting that most of the kings of Israel are crappy.
Jennifer finds it extremely interesting that most of the kings of Israel are crappy. Not my word, her word. That's a direct quote. That of all the miracles that were transpiring there, and they see it over and over again, and yet they would not bow the knee. Whether they thought it was a political suicide for them to do that or what.
I don't get it.
There was something there that they felt was too costly. Pride.
But we see it over and over, especially with this one guy. Why? At some
Joram.
point, wouldn't you say, wow,
Yeah.
I get it now.
He has such close encounters with Pharisees are right there walking in the midst of Christ, getting to see the finger of God move among them. And yet they say, let's devise a way to snuff out the light of the world. Let's devise a way to kill him. Let's hire Judas. That's weird.
As Kathy Bear once said, the middle letter of sin is I. That I gets us into trouble a lot.
Yeah, and it's also the middle letter of pride.
Oh, okay.
So there you have it.
Our thing, Kathy.
The problem of stubbornness. Dare to bow the knee. All right, let us close in prayer. Gracious God, we don't know where we're at in this story. If we're Naaman or Gehazi or the little servant girl that's feeling trapped and in hostage and imprisoned. But Lord, we do desire to turn to you, to rid ourselves of pride, where we're the center of the universe, where the world revolves around us. Father, we want it to revolve around you, that you would receive all the glory, all the honor that's due your name, that you would be high and lifted up. That just like Elisha, we would step back and just administer your words, administer your good news, and just step back out of the limelight and give you all the praise and all the honor. Lord, search us, try us, see if there be leprosy in us. We know it started off small for Naaman, and so if there's anything like that going on in our life, do a work, do a cleansing, do a purifying in our life. If there's something that we can do to participate in that, knowing that it wasn't anymore the Jordan River that cleansed Naaman or the ditches that were dug that provided water, but if there's something that we need to be doing in cooperation with your outpouring and working, show us what it is and give us hearts that are willing to do it. As we look at 2 Kings chapter 6 this week, we pray that your Spirit would talk to us, challenge us, communicate with us. Exact word for our soul's sake and for anyone that we might be ministering with or to or help walking alongside of. We want to be a person that is set aside for you and holy for you, but we also want to be ministers. We want to be helpers, encouragers to others along the way. So have your way this week. Show us thyself, and may we give you thanks, whether in captivity, whether with leprosy, or whether experiencing you in restorative ways. May we always return and give you thanks. In Jesus' name, Amen.